The first mistake Tyler Brooks made was assuming that history always wears a uniform. Walter Harlan arrived at the north gate of Naval Station Norfolk just after 8 in the morning. The Virginia sky was the color of hammered steel, and a biting wind off the Elizabeth River cut through the wool coats of the gathering crowd. Beyond the chain-link fence, the ceremony yard was a hive of precise military movement. Flags snapped violently against their halyards. Hundreds of pristine folding chairs stood in geometric perfection. The low, thunderous notes of a brass band warming up drifted over the asphalt. Families moved toward the security checkpoint in their Sunday best. They held glowing digital passes on smartphones, crisp invitation cards, and glossy paper programs. Walter stood quietly among them. He was a man in his mid-70s, his silver hair cut high and tight, his shoulders narrow but rigidly straight beneath a faded navy blue peacoat. In his rough, age-spotted hands, he carefully held a physical envelope. The envelope looked older than some of the junior officers directing traffic. Its corners were soft and frayed. But it was the name printed on the front that mattered. There was a typographical error, a single wrong letter in his last name. Walter had noticed it the moment he pulled it from his mailbox in Virginia Beach. Still, he had polished his 20-year-old black Oxfords, shaved perfectly smooth, folded the invitation, and driven 17 miles before sunrise. The letter stated he was an honored guest of Admiral Richard Calloway's office. He did not wear a chest full of medals. He did not wear a cap announcing his service. He carried only that envelope and the profound, heavy silence of a man who had survived years that the modern world had stopped asking about. At the checkpoint, Tyler Brooks stood holding a tablet. At 28, Tyler was broad-shouldered, clean-shaven, and entirely convinced that authority came from the badge clipped to his tactical vest. He was checking passes with the robotic efficiency of someone who believed machines never lied. When Walter stepped up to the line, Tyler did not even look him in the eye. He simply extended a hand. Walter placed the worn envelope into it. Tyler glanced at the handwritten address, tapped his tablet, frowned, and tapped again, harder this time, as if the screen was acting insubordinate. "You are not in the system," Tyler said, his voice clipped and dismissive. Walter's reply was low, steady, and entirely devoid of panic. "I was invited by Admiral Calloway's office." There might be a slight spelling error on the envelope. Tyler finally looked up. He scanned Walter from the scuffed tips of his shoes to the collar of his old coat. To Tyler, this was not a veteran, this was a logistical headache holding up his line. Behind Walter, the crowd began to shift nervously. A woman checked her watch. Tyler shoved the envelope back. "Step aside, sir. This line is for cleared and invited guests only. No digital pass, no badge, no entry." He said it loudly. Too loudly. The humiliation hung in the cold air, but Walter did not flinch. He did not demand to see a supervisor. He did not shout about his rights or his past. Men of his era learned long ago that dignity is not something you spend on every minor insult. Walter simply folded the envelope, held it against his chest, and stepped out of the line. He stood by the steel barricade, watching as the crowd flowed past him like water around a stone. Some threw him pitying glances, others looked away in second-hand embarrassment. Tyler Brooks called out, next, completely satisfied that he had neutralized a threat to his perfectly scheduled morning. A few yards away, Emily Carter was watching. As the civilian event coordinator, her job was to ensure the memorial ran without a single flaw before the brass noticed. She noticed Walter because he was the only person she had ever seen who looked completely at peace while being publicly rejected. Emily walked over to Tyler. "What is the issue with the older gentleman?" "Guest not listed," Tyler scoffed, not looking up from his screen. "Brought a paper envelope. Name does not match the database. Claims the Admiral invited him." Emily looked closely at Walter. His coat was worn, but it was immaculately clean. His posture was not defeated, it was disciplined. She approached him gently. "Sir, may I see your invitation?" "Of course, ma'am," Walter said, handing it over with both hands. Emily read the label, Chief Walter Harlan. The last name ended with an E instead of an A, below it was a highly classified routing code from a commemorative office. "It is just a spelling error," Emily said, turning back to Tyler. "Call the event command inside and verify." "I am not tying up the comms channel for a walk-in with a typo," Tyler snapped. "He can wait outside the perimeter until the ceremony is over." Before Emily could reprimand Tyler, a deafening, metallic shriek tore through the morning air. The loudspeakers inside the ceremony yard exploded with harsh, ear-splitting static. Several people in the crowd cried out and covered their ears. The brass band stopped playing instantly. Inside the VIP tent, a young communications technician frantically ripped off his headset, his hands flying across a soundboard that was completely unresponsive. Tyler pressed the radio on his chest. "Command, what is that noise?" "Say again." Only a high-pitched whine answered him. The entire multi-million-dollar audio system of the naval base had just suffered a catastrophic feedback loop. The memorial was minutes away from beginning, and the yard was descending into chaos. Senior officers were exchanging furious looks. Walter Harlan lifted his head. For the first time all morning, the quiet old man was fully engaged. His pale blue eyes traced the speaker wires along the temporary scaffolding. He looked past the flags, analyzing the relay antenna mounted on the roof of the West Maintenance Building. He was not looking at it with confusion. He was reading the frequency failure the way a seasoned captain reads a shifting tide. "Your West relay is not dead," Walter said softly. Tyler turned, glaring. "Excuse me. The West relay is bleeding across 2 channels. The alignment is off by several degrees. It is creating a feedback loop." Tyler let out a harsh, patronizing laugh. "You can diagnose a modern, encrypted Navy communications grid from the parking lot?" "Not from the parking lot," Walter replied, his voice chillingly calm. "From the sound." Tyler stepped forward, his patience gone. "Listen to me, old man. This is not some vacuum tube museum radio. Stay behind the barrier and keep quiet." Inside the yard, the panic escalated. The technician was practically tearing cables out of the board. The static grew louder, a violent crackling that threatened to ruin the entire memorial. Emily had seen enough. Ignoring Tyler, she grabbed a spare tactical handheld radio from the checkpoint table. She walked right up to the barricade and held it out to Walter. "Emily, what are you doing?" "He is not cleared," Tyler yelled. "Sir," Emily said, looking directly into Walter's eyes, "can you help them?" Walter looked at the modern, digital radio. To him, it was not a piece of plastic. It was a bridge to a life he had left behind. Slowly, his calloused fingers took the device. The moment his hands gripped the hard casing, his entire demeanor transformed. The fragile posture of a 70-year-old man vanished. He did not fumble. He did not ask how it worked. His thumb found the squelch dial instinctively. He adjusted the frequency, filtering out the chaotic noise of the panicked officers on the open channel. He pressed the push-to-talk button, and when he spoke, his voice was a weapon of absolute precision. "Control, this is Harlan at the North Gate. Your West relay is 5 degrees off east bearing. Reduce your gain and hold the primary channel." The static on the massive loudspeakers immediately thinned. It did not disappear, but it fractured. Inside the yard, the frantic technician froze. Walter listened to the hiss, his eyes narrowing. He pressed the button again, his voice echoing out over the enormous loudspeakers for all 2,000 attendees to hear. "Do not chase the noise. Hold north. Do not break formation." At the very front of the VIP platform, Admiral Richard Calloway was preparing to take the podium. A decorated 4-star commander, Calloway had commanded fleets and survived decades of modern warfare. But when those words echoed through the yard, "Hold north," Do not break formation. The blood drained completely from the Admiral's face. The white dress glove slipped from Calloway's hand and fell to the concrete floor. He was not standing in Virginia anymore. In a fraction of a second, the 72-year-old Admiral was violently pulled back 50 years in time. It was 1976. The North Atlantic. Calloway was just a 22-year-old ensign, terrified and soaked to the bone, standing in the cramped, freezing combat information center of a destroyer caught in the worst rogue hurricane of the decade. The waves were 60 feet high, smashing against the steel hull like sledgehammers. The sky was pitch black. The ship was rolling so violently that men were being thrown across the bulkheads. Then, the unthinkable happened. The primary radar array was sheared completely off the mast by a rogue wave. Their navigational instruments went blind. The compass spun wildly. The internal comms were failing. They were completely blind in a graveyard of churning water, drifting dangerously close to a jagged coastline that would tear the hull open in minutes. Young Calloway had been gripping the radio handset, his knuckles white, listening to the terrified, overlapping voices of other junior officers across the fleet who were also lost in the dark. Panic was a contagion, and it was spreading through the fleet. Men were screaming over the radio, begging for coordinates, their voices cracking with the realization that they were going to die in the dark water. And then, cutting through the violent static of the storm, came a voice from a neighboring cruiser's radio room. It was not a shout. It was not frantic. It was a voice anchored in absolute, unshakable granite. Hold north. Do not break formation. For 6 agonizing hours, that unknown chief petty officer stayed on the frequency. When the radar failed, this man used dead reckoning and audio bouncing to guide them. Every time Calloway thought the ship was going down, that voice would crackle through the speaker, providing a course correction, an anchor of sanity in the abyss. That voice did not just give orders, it gave them the courage to survive the night. By dawn, the storm broke. The fleet was battered, but alive. Calloway never met the man who saved them. He only knew the name jotted down on a frantic after-action report, a name that was misspelled by a clerk and eventually buried in the archives. But Calloway never, ever forgot the voice. Back in the present, the Norfolk yard was dead silent. The wind whipped at the flags. Calloway turned to his aide, Lieutenant Commander Pierce, his eyes wide. "Who is on that radio?" "I believe it is someone at the North Gate security checkpoint, Admiral," Pierce said, confused. "Sir, you are due at the podium." Calloway ignored him. He stepped off the VIP platform and began walking down the center aisle. He did not walk, he marched. As he moved, a wave of silence parted the sea of military brass. 2,000 pairs of eyes watched as the 4-star Admiral bypassed the ceremony and headed straight for the perimeter fence. At the gate, Tyler Brooks was furious. He snatched the radio out of Walter's hand. "That is enough. You are breaching security protocol." "The signal is fixed," Walter said quietly. "I do not care. You are a civilian without clearance, and you are leaving this base right now." Tyler snarled, stepping into Walter's personal space. "Is there a problem here, son?" Tyler froze. The voice came from right behind him. Tyler spun around, his jaw dropping. Admiral Calloway stood on the other side of the barricade, his chest covered in a blinding array of ribbons. Behind him stood Emily, holding her clipboard, her eyes wide. "Admiral, sir." Tyler stammered, snapping into a rigid salute. "This man is an unapproved walk-in. His name is not in the system. I was just executing protocol to remove him." Calloway did not even look at Tyler. His eyes were locked, entirely and completely, on the old man in the faded blue coat. Walter stood tall, his hands resting by his sides. The two men stared at each other across the chain-link fence. The distance between them was 3 feet of pavement, but it bridged half a century of unspoken history. "Say it again," Calloway whispered, his voice thick with an emotion no one had ever seen from the hardened commander. Tyler blinked. "Sir." "Not you," Calloway barked, silencing the guard instantly. The Admiral looked at Walter. "The line you just gave the comms team. Say it again." Walter looked down. At the concrete. A profound discomfort washed over him. He had spent his whole life doing his duty in the shadows, expecting nothing in return. Praise was an alien language to him. "It was a long time ago, Admiral," Walter said softly. "I have heard it in my sleep every night since," Calloway replied. The Admiral's voice broke. He took a step closer to the fence. "Please. Chief." Walter lifted his head. The wind blew his silver hair back. He looked the Admiral in the eye, and the voice of the storm returned. "Hold north. Do not break formation." Calloway closed his eyes. A single tear escaped the corner of his eye, tracing a line down his weathered cheek. Without a word of command, without any protocol dictating it, the four-star Admiral slowly reached up and removed his pristine white dress cap. He held it over his heart. The officers standing 30 yards away saw the gesture and immediately stiffened, realizing they were witnessing something profoundly sacred. "Chief Walter Harlan," Calloway said, saying the name clearly so the wind would carry it. "Yes, sir," Walter replied. Calloway turned slightly, addressing the dead silent crowd that had gathered at the checkpoint. 50 years ago, I was a junior officer on a ship that was sinking in the dark. We were blind. We were terrified. We needed a lifeline. This man was our lifeline. He was the voice that brought us home." Calloway turned his gaze to Tyler Brooks. The young guard was pale, shaking slightly, his tablet hanging uselessly at his side. "Who told him to step out of line?" Calloway asked. It was not a shout. It was a cold, surgical question. Tyler swallowed hard. "I did, sir." His name, the system flagged an error. One letter was wrong. Calloway stared at the digital tablet, then back at Tyler. "A machine missed a letter, son. But a man should never miss a life. Protocol is what we use when we lack the judgment to see the human being standing in front of us." Tyler looked down at his boots, utterly dismantled. The lesson would burn in his chest for the rest of his career. "Emily," Calloway said without looking away. "Fix the record." Emily typed furiously on the tablet. Within seconds, a green banner flashed. "Chief Walter Harlan. Cleared." "Open the gate," Calloway ordered. Tyler practically dove for the button. The heavy steel gate swung inward with a loud clank. Walter hesitated. For a man who had been pushed aside by the world, stepping into the light required a terrifying amount of courage. Calloway did not rush him. The Admiral simply stepped to the side and waited. The entire naval base waited. Slowly, Walter Harlan stepped onto the ceremony grounds. As he did, a ripple moved through the crowd. An old Master Chief in the front row removed his cap and placed it over his heart. A younger sailor followed suit. Without any music playing, without any orders given, 2,000 people stood in absolute silence as Walter Harlan walked down the center aisle. He walked beside the Admiral. The contrast was breathtaking. The pristine, heavily decorated white uniform of the fleet commander, walking shoulder to shoulder with the faded, unadorned blue coat of the forgotten radioman. Yet, in that moment, the old blue coat commanded more respect than all the brass in the yard. Calloway led Walter not to the guest seating, but to the very front row, to a solitary chair marked with a velvet rope. It was the chair reserved for the missing in action, a symbolic place for those who had been lost or forgotten. "Admiral, I cannot sit there," Walter whispered. "Chief," Calloway said gently, "the men who truly deserve that seat are always the ones who try to refuse it." Walter sat. Emily walked up quietly and placed a brand new, freshly printed program in his lap. He looked down at it. His name, Walter Harlan, spelled perfectly, in bold black ink. Calloway took the podium. He closed his prepared speech folder. He looked out at the sea of uniforms, at Tyler standing humbled at the back gate, and finally, at the old man in the front row. "Today, a mistake was made at our gates," Calloway's voice boomed over the newly fixed speakers. "A man was told he did not belong because a database could not recognize him. But service, true service, is not validated by a computer screen. It lives in the actions of those who hold the line when everyone else is ready to break." Calloway paused, looking directly at Walter. "Some heroes do not carry rifles. Some heroes carry a radio frequency. And their voices never leave the men they saved." At the conclusion of the ceremony, as the final notes of taps echoed over the water, Calloway stepped down from the stage. He walked over to Walter. The old chief stood up, his knees popping, his back straightening into the posture of the young sailor he once was. Calloway did not offer his hand. Instead, the four-star Admiral snapped to attention and delivered a slow, perfectly crisp salute. Walter's hand trembled as it rose to his brow. He returned the salute. It was not the flawless motion of a parade guard, it was the heavy, beautiful salute of a man who had survived. At the back of the yard, Tyler Brooks watched through tear-filled eyes. He finally understood what the uniform really meant. It was not about the rules you enforced. It was about the people you remembered. The system had tried to erase Walter Harlan. But a man's legacy is not stored on a hard drive. It is forged in the storm, and it echoes forever.